Thanks for staying with Newsnight tonight. Well, the EFF could be set for some good news in next year's polls. The Institute for Race Relations expects the Red Berets to double their support base. This is at the expense of the ANC. This means the EFF may enjoy 13% in support, while the ANC may slip from 62 to 52% in the 2019 elections. Meanwhile, the DA will poll at 23%. At least that's the projections that are coming in from the South African Institute Relations. The head of politics and governance, Gareth van Onselen, joins us now from our Cape Town studios. Gareth, before we get into the actual findings of the survey, let's talk about your research a little bit. What were some of the research questions that you asked those that were part of the survey?
Right. Well, two things. First of all, just to correct your introduction a bit, the numbers are not a prediction. They're just a illustration of how voters feel at the moment. As far as our methodology goes, we interviewed just under 1,000 registered voters. The interview was conducted by phone. It's a fully demographically representative sample, which means it reflects the country's demographics, and it's weighted against rural and urban voters. And it was in the field from the 22nd of August to the 4th of September.
Yes, and what were the questions that you were asking those that were part of the survey?
Right, sorry. Okay, so it was a full political survey, so it actually comprised about 60 questions. About 30 of those questions are demographic questions to gauge people's race, gender, age, whether they're employed or not. And then we had a set of about 20 political questions. So the majority of them focused on voting intention. In other words, who would you vote for if an election was held tomorrow? We then had a series of questions about favorability, about 5 questions concerning land, and a series of other questions on Cyril Ramaphosa's performance. But of all of those, we've only released the voting intention information to date.
Let's talk about then that voting intention. What did you ask people? And it's important to know what you asked so that we can also, I suppose, link some of the conclusions that you are drawing out of those samples of people that you've spoken to.
Sure. Well, as I said in my previous answer, we asked people, who would you vote for if an election was held tomorrow?
Oh, so you asked them who they would vote for if an election was held tomorrow. And basically then the results that you've given us today are the answers that they gave in response to that question.
That is correct.
All right. What were the other concerns that they raised as you probed further in terms of the standing of the other political parties, the ANC? Because you specifically say that the EFF will gain ANC voters. So was it ANC voters in particular that gave you these answers?
Yes, well, we did a number of questions to arrive at that conclusion. One of them was we looked at favorability. So we asked ANC supporters and DA supporters how they felt about the EFF. And 25% of ANC supporters said they felt somewhat or very favorable towards the ANC, which compares to just 10% amongst DA voters. And what that tells you is that there's a large pool of ANC voters who are favorable to the EFF, and it explains how that party has been able to eat into the ANC's support. Of course, you could also just look at the numbers. The EFF is currently on 13% according to our poll, and the ANC on 52%. The ANC was on 62% in 2014, so it appears that that 10% has shifted to the EFF.
Let's just explore that issue of favorability a little bit closer, Gareth. So was the question, would you vote for the EFF tomorrow? Are you open to voting for them? Or was it a definite yes and no, I will or I won't?
No, what it is it's called a favorability question. So you ask all respondents a single question, which is, how do you feel about the EFF? And you ask them to rate their feeling from 1 to 100, 1 being very cold and unfavorable, and 100 being very favorable. And then you stagger the answers. So if we put that question and we draw out just ANC voters and their response to that question with regards to the EFF, 25% of them said they were somewhat or very favorable towards the EFF.
All right, but of course, as you mentioned, they're not specifically outright saying that they will vote for the EFF. And those that didn't have an answer, you know, those that were caught between the line, that what were their responses?
Right. Well, we had a very small number of undecided responses. About 2% of respondents were undecided, and about 10% refused to answer. So what we do with those respondents who don't give us an answer is we assign them a party political affiliation based on their response to favorability questions. In the first instance, if they're 50% or more favorable towards a political party, we assign their support to that party. If that doesn't work, then we use their favorability towards political leaders. And if they're 50% or more favorable to a leader, we assign them to that party. And that way we manage to decide to assign all undecideds to a party political preference, and there are none left.
And I know that part of the numbers that you're working with, Gareth, also just leads you to estimates and really reading into data. But what is the margin of error there between the favorability and the actual voting? I don't know if my question is clear.
Well, there's a standard margin of error for the whole poll, which applies to every single question, which is 3.1%. And what that means for viewers is that any given answer in a poll could either be 3% up or 3% down. Now, 3% is a standard margin of error for all polls. It's impossible not to have one because they can't be 100% accurate. But it's important to bear that margin of error in mind when you read the results. So just by practical illustration, the EFF could be on 13%. It could also be on 16 or 10. But we believe the median score is 13, and so that's what we've put in our survey.
All right. Thanks for coming on to Newsnight to unpack some of your findings there. The Institute of Race Relations Head of Politics and Governance, Gareth van Onselen, on that particular report.